story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Blake Morrison had always believed in building empires, not just businesses. At 42, he owned a chain of high-end auto dealerships across 3 states, each one a testament to his relentless pursuit of perfection. His hands, calloused from years of working on engines before he could afford to hire mechanics, now signed contracts worth millions. Blake had clawed his way up from a trailer park in rural Tennessee, where his alcoholic father had taught him the most valuable lesson of his life: never depend on anyone, because everyone will eventually let you down. That philosophy had served him well in business, but somehow, he'd let his guard down when it came to Tiffany. Tiffany Morrison, née Walsh, had been the daughter of a local banker when Blake first spotted her at a charity auction 15 years ago. She was 23, fresh out of college with a marketing degree she'd never used, and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that made men forget their own names. Blake, then a struggling owner of a single dealership, had spent his last $3,000 to win a date with her at that auction. She'd laughed at his jokes, admired his ambition, and within 6 months, they were married. The early years had been different. Tiffany had seemed content with their modest 2-bedroom house, had even helped with the dealership's books when money was tight. She'd given him 2 children, Emma, now 14, and Caleb, 12, and for a while, Blake had allowed himself to believe he'd found something his father never had: a loyal family. But success had changed things. As the dealerships multiplied and the money poured in, Tiffany had developed expensive tastes. The modest house became a 6-bedroom mansion. The Honda became a BMW, then a Mercedes, then a collection of luxury cars she barely drove. The woman who once clipped coupons now spent more on a single shopping trip than most people made in a month. Blake had indulged it all, mistaking materialism for happiness. He worked 18-hour days, traveled constantly for business, and came home to a wife who barely looked up from her phone and children who saw him as an ATM with legs. But he'd told himself it was temporary, that once he'd secured their future, things would go back to how they used to be. He should have remembered his father's lesson. The signs had been there for months, obvious in hindsight. Tiffany's sudden interest in fitness, the new clothes, the mysterious phone calls she'd take in other rooms. The way she'd started picking fights about his work schedule, accusing him of neglecting the family, while simultaneously demanding he provide more and more for her lifestyle. The nights she'd claimed to be out with girlfriends, coming home smelling like cologne that wasn't his. Blake had noticed it all, filed it away in the back of his mind, but refused to acknowledge what it meant. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that his father had been right about everyone, even the people you love most. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in March. Blake had returned early from a business trip to Dallas, planning to surprise Tiffany with dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date. He'd even bought flowers, white roses, her favorites. He'd found the house empty except for a note from the babysitter saying she'd taken the kids to soccer practice. Tiffany's car was gone, but her location showed she was at the Marriott downtown. Blake had driven there with the flowers wilting on his passenger seat, telling himself there had to be an explanation. There had been an explanation, all right. He'd found her in the hotel bar, tucked into a corner booth with a man Blake recognized from the country club, Kyle Brennan, a personal trainer who specialized in lifestyle coaching for wealthy housewives. Kyle was younger, tanned, with the kind of easy smile that suggested he'd never worked a real day in his life. He was feeding Tiffany strawberries and whispering in her ear while she giggled like a teenager. Blake had stood in the doorway for a full minute, watching his wife of 15 years act like a lovesick fool with a man who probably couldn't even spell the names of the cars she drove. The white roses had felt impossibly heavy in his hands. He'd turned around and left without saying a word. That night, when Tiffany came home with some story about meeting a girlfriend for drinks, Blake had simply nodded and gone to his study. He'd sat there until dawn, staring at wedding photos and wondering when exactly he'd become such a fool. But Blake Morrison hadn't built an empire by wallowing in self-pity. He'd built it by being smarter, more ruthless, and more patient than his competition. If Tiffany wanted to play games, he'd show her what a real player looked like. He just hadn't expected her to be quite so bold about it. Chapter 2. The Discovery. 3 weeks after the hotel incident, Blake hired a private investigator named Roy Hutchins, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. Roy was expensive, discreet, and had a reputation for finding dirt that other investigators missed. Blake had used him before to vet potential business partners, and Roy had never disappointed. "Give me everything," Blake had told him. "I want to know what she eats for breakfast, when she breathes, and every second she spends with this Kyle character." Roy had delivered within a week. The evidence was overwhelming and humiliating in its scope. Tiffany and Kyle had been meeting 3 times a week for 2 months, not just for sex, but for elaborate dates that Blake was unknowingly funding. Expensive dinners, weekend trips to resorts, shopping sprees where Kyle picked out lingerie that Blake would never see. They'd even taken a romantic getaway to Napa Valley, telling Blake she was visiting her sister in Portland. But the photographs were what had really driven the knife home. Tiffany looked happier in those pictures than she had in years of family photos. She was laughing, touching Kyle constantly, looking at him the way she used to look at Blake back when he was still foolish enough to believe in love. The final insult had come in the form of text messages Roy had intercepted. Tiffany and Kyle weren't just having an affair, they were planning a future together. Kyle was pressuring her to leave Blake, and Tiffany was hesitating only because she was trying to figure out how to maximize her divorce settlement. "He's never home anyway," one message read. "Emma and Caleb barely know him. You'd be a better father than he's ever been. When are you going to tell him?" Kyle had responded, "I'm tired of sneaking around like we're criminals. You deserve better than being married to some workaholic who treats you like a trophy." "Soon," Tiffany had replied. "I just need to make sure I get enough to support our lifestyle. Blake owes me that much after all these years of neglect." Blake had read those messages in his office at midnight, surrounded by the trophies and awards that represented years of sacrifice and hard work. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, had been for his family, and they saw him as nothing more than a paycheck with an inconvenient attachment. He'd made 2 phone calls that night. The first was to his lawyer, instructing him to begin quietly moving assets into protected accounts. The second was to a man named Leo Cardenas, who handled specialized security solutions for business executives who found themselves in delicate situations. Blake had met Leo 5 years earlier when a competitor had tried to sabotage one of his dealerships with false reviews and planted evidence of safety violations. Leo had solved the problem quickly and quietly, and the competitor had mysteriously decided to relocate his business to another state. "I need you to set up surveillance on my house," Blake had told Leo. "Full coverage, inside and outside. I want every conversation recorded, every movement tracked. And I want it installed while my family is out of town this weekend." "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Leo had asked. "However long it takes," Blake had replied. "This isn't going to be quick." That weekend, while Tiffany took the kids to visit her mother in Atlanta, Leo's team had transformed Blake's home into a monitoring station. Cameras in every room except the children's bedrooms, audio pickup devices that could record a whisper from across the house, and GPS trackers on every vehicle in the garage. Blake would know everything that happened in his home, even when he wasn't there. Especially when he wasn't there. The first major breakthrough had come 2 weeks later. Blake had been in his office, monitoring the live feeds on his phone, when he'd watched Kyle Brennan walk through his front door as if he owned the place. Tiffany had been waiting for him in a silk robe that Blake had bought her for their anniversary, and within minutes, they were headed upstairs to the master bedroom, Blake's bedroom, in Blake's bed. But it wasn't the adultery that had caught Blake's attention. It was what Kyle had said as they'd undressed. "When this is all over, we should keep this house. It's got good bones, and the kids are already comfortable here. Blake can find somewhere else to live." "Are you sure that's possible?" Tiffany had asked. "Even with the evidence we're manufacturing?" "Trust me," Kyle had replied. "I've done this before. Rich guys like Blake never see it coming because they think their money makes them untouchable. By the time we're done, he'll be lucky to keep one of his dealerships." Blake had saved that recording, along with dozens of others over the following weeks. He'd learned that Kyle wasn't just a personal trainer. He was a professional con artist who specialized in seducing wealthy married women, manipulating them into divorces, and then taking a cut of the settlement. Tiffany wasn't his first victim. She was just his most lucrative target. The plan they'd hatched was elaborate and vicious. Kyle had been coaching Tiffany on how to document Blake's supposed emotional abuse, teaching her to fake injuries, and helping her plant evidence of his alleged infidelity. They'd even arranged for Kyle to catch Blake in a compromising position with one of Kyle's female accomplices, giving Tiffany grounds for a fault divorce that would entitle her to a larger settlement. But their most devastating move had been turning the children against him. Blake had watched in real time as Kyle manipulated Emma and Caleb, filling their heads with stories about their father's supposed neglect and cruelty. He'd bought them expensive gifts, taken them to events Blake was too busy to attend, and gradually positioned himself as the father figure they'd been missing. Within a month, Blake's own children were calling Kyle Dad and referring to Blake by his first name. The breaking point had come on a Friday evening when Blake had tried to take Emma to a father-daughter dance at her school. She'd looked at him with the same cold indifference Tiffany had perfected and said, "I already have a date. Kyle's taking me. He actually cares about things that matter to me." Blake had spent that weekend in his office, staring at security footage of Kyle playing catch with Caleb in the backyard while Tiffany watched adoringly from the porch. His children were laughing harder than they had in years, and Blake realized he was watching his family, his real family, and he wasn't part of it. That's when he decided to stop playing defense and start playing offense. If Tiffany and Kyle wanted to destroy his life, he'd show them what destruction really looked like. The game was about to change, and Blake Morrison always played to win. Chapter 3: The Text and the Trap. Blake's opportunity came on a Monday morning in late September. He'd been planning his counterattack for weeks, moving money, securing evidence, and positioning his pieces like a chess master preparing for checkmate. All he needed was the right moment to spring the trap. Tiffany provided it herself. Blake had been at his downtown dealership negotiating a fleet sale with a corporate client when his phone buzzed with a text message. He'd expected it to be from his assistant about the afternoon's appointments. Instead, it was from Tiffany, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "I've moved my boyfriend in. The kids call him Dad now. Don't bother coming back." Blake had stared at the message for a full minute, sitting in his office while his client waited in the conference room. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, and everything he'd sacrificed for his family. And this was how it ended, with a text message delivered like a ransom note. But instead of rage, Blake felt something else: relief. The waiting was over. The pretending was done. Tiffany had finally shown her true colors, and now he was free to show his. He'd typed back quickly, "Cute. Hope he likes paying for everything." Then he'd made the call he'd been preparing for weeks. "Janet, it's Blake Morrison," he'd said to his banker. "I need you to freeze the joint account immediately. Full stop on all cards, all access, everything." "Mr. Morrison, are you sure?" "Mrs. Morrison has been quite active on that account lately." "Especially Mrs. Morrison," Blake had interrupted. "She no longer has authorization for any of our joint assets. I'll be in this afternoon to sign the paperwork." Blake had been funding that account to the tune of $15,000 a month, money that covered the mortgage on their house, both car payments, credit card bills, and Tiffany's seemingly endless shopping habits. Kyle Brennan was about to learn what it cost to maintain a lifestyle he could never afford. The second call had been to Leo Cardenas. "It's time," Blake had said simply. "You want me to activate the secondary protocols?" "All of them. I want everything ready to go by tonight." The third call had been the most important one, and Blake had savored every digit as he dialed the number for family court. Judge Patricia Henley owed Blake a favor, a big one, dating back to when Blake had quietly donated $100,000 to the children's charity she championed. More importantly, she had a reputation for being unsympathetic to cheating spouses, especially when children were involved. "Your Honor, this is Blake Morrison. I need an emergency hearing." The reaction had been swift and brutal. 3 hours after Blake had frozen the accounts, his phone had exploded with frantic calls from Tiffany. He'd let them all go to voicemail, listening later as her voice progressed from confusion to anger to panic. "Blake, what the hell did you do? My card isn't working. Answer your phone right now. This isn't funny. The car just got repossessed. What did you do?" Blake had saved the best for last, finally answering her fourth call while he sat in his lawyer's office, signing papers that would change everything. "Blake, thank God. You have to fix this right now. Kyle went to pick up groceries, and they impounded his car in the parking lot. They said the payments haven't been made in 3 months. That's unfortunate," Blake had said calmly. "Maybe you should call Kyle's bank. This is our car. You can't just... Actually, it's my car. Registered in my name, insured under my policy, and purchased with my money. Just like everything else you've been enjoying. You bastard. You can't leave us stranded like this." "I can and I will. Good luck explaining to the kids why Daddy Kyle can't afford to take care of them. Blake had hung up and immediately called Leo back. Phase 2 is a go, he'd said. I want them to understand exactly what they're dealing with. By sunset, Blake's plan was in full motion. The house, which was solely in Blake's name, thanks to a prenuptial agreement Tiffany had been too love-struck to read carefully, was now under surveillance by a private security firm. Kyle's attempts to enter were being documented for the restraining order Blake's lawyer was preparing. But the real masterstroke had been Blake's call to Emma's school. As the father and primary financial supporter, Blake had every right to remove his children from the after-school programs Kyle had enrolled them in. He'd also canceled their memberships to the country club, the tennis academy, and every other activity that Kyle had been using to bond with them. Most devastating of all, Blake had called his accountant and restructured the trust funds he'd established for Emma and Caleb's college education. The money was still there, still theirs, but now it came with conditions. They had to maintain a relationship with their father, achieve specific academic benchmarks, and demonstrate what Blake's lawyer had carefully termed appropriate respect for family values. The beauty of it was that Blake hadn't done anything illegal or even technically unfair. He was simply exercising his rights as a husband, father, and property owner. If Tiffany wanted to leave him for Kyle, she was free to do so, but she'd be doing it with nothing but the clothes on her back. That evening, Blake had driven past his house, his former house, and seen Kyle's truck parked in the driveway. Through the security footage he was still receiving on his phone, he'd watched Kyle pacing angrily through the kitchen while Tiffany sat at the breakfast bar with her head in her hands. This is temporary, Kyle was saying. He's just trying to scare us. Once the divorce goes through, we'll get half of everything. What if we don't? Tiffany had whispered. What if he fights it? You don't know Blake like I do. When he wants something, he gets it. Then we'll make sure he doesn't have a choice, Kyle had replied, and Blake had seen him pull out his phone. I've got friends who know how to handle guys like your husband. Rich boys who think their money makes them untouchable. Blake had smiled as he'd saved that recording. Kyle had just threatened him, on tape, in Blake's own house. That would make the restraining order much easier to obtain. But more importantly, Kyle had just shown Blake exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. This wasn't going to be a civilized divorce proceeding. This was going to be a war. And Blake Morrison had been preparing for war his entire life. As he'd driven to his temporary apartment downtown, a luxury penthouse he'd quietly leased months ago, Blake had felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement. For too long, he'd been playing by other people's rules, trying to be the husband and father he thought his family wanted. Now he was going to be the man his father had raised him to be, ruthless, unforgiving, and utterly without mercy for those who betrayed him. Tiffany and Kyle had started this game thinking they were playing against a soft businessman who valued family over everything else. They were about to discover they'd actually declared war on a man who had clawed his way out of poverty by destroying everyone who stood in his way. And Blake Morrison never forgot the lessons that poverty had taught him. Chapter 4: The Architect of Ruin. Blake's penthouse apartment occupied the top floor of the Morrison Tower, a commercial building he'd purchased 3 years earlier as an investment property. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now living in a building that bore his name while his cheating wife played house with her boyfriend in the home he'd bought her. But the apartment served a purpose beyond shelter. From his floor-to-ceiling windows, Blake could see his former house 12 blocks away, and more importantly, he'd converted the second bedroom into a command center for the war he was about to wage. 3 massive monitors displayed feeds from the security cameras still operating in his house, while a fourth showed real-time tracking data from the GPS devices Leo's team had planted on every vehicle Tiffany and Kyle had access to. A secure phone line connected him directly to Leo, while encrypted email accounts let him coordinate with his lawyer, his accountant, and the private investigator who was still digging into Kyle's background. Blake had always been methodical in business, but this was different. This was personal, and he was bringing resources to bear that most people couldn't even imagine. The first phase of his plan had been simple: financial strangulation. Within 72 hours of Tiffany's text message, Blake had systematically dismantled every financial support system she'd taken for granted. The joint account was frozen. The credit cards were canceled. The house phone, internet, and cable were disconnected. Even the grocery delivery service that had been automatically charging Blake's accounts was terminated. But that was just the beginning. Blake's second call had been to Patricia Henley, his children's pediatrician and a woman who'd known Emma and Caleb since they were babies. Dr. Henley had been disturbed to learn that the children were living with an unrelated adult male without proper background checks or custody arrangements. Mr. Morrison, I have to advise you that this situation could be considered child endangerment, she'd said during their phone call. If Mr. Brennan hasn't been properly vetted, and if he's essentially acting as a guardian without legal authority. That's exactly what I'm concerned about, Blake had replied. I think we need to involve Child Protective Services to ensure Emma and Caleb's safety. The CPS investigation had been swift and thorough. Kyle's background check had revealed 2 prior restraining orders filed by ex-girlfriends, a bankruptcy from 3 years earlier, and a suspended license due to unpaid child support for a daughter in Nevada. None of it was necessarily disqualifying, but all of it painted a picture of a man who made poor decisions and didn't honor his commitments. More damaging was the psychological evaluation CPS had required for all adults in the household. Kyle had failed spectacularly, displaying what the psychologist had termed narcissistic tendencies and an unhealthy fixation on material wealth. Tiffany hadn't fared much better, coming across as emotionally dependent and lacking clear boundaries regarding her children's welfare. The report had recommended immediate supervised visitation only, pending a full custody hearing. Blake's third stroke had been the most devastating. He'd reached out to Kyle's previous victims. Roy Hutchins, the private investigator, had earned every dollar Blake was paying him. Kyle Brennan wasn't just a serial adulterer. He was a professional predator who'd been running the same scam for nearly a decade. Roy had identified 4 other wealthy women Kyle had seduced, manipulated into divorces, and then abandoned once he'd gotten his cut of their settlement money. The most recent victim was a woman named Monica Reeves, whose husband had owned a chain of restaurants in Kentucky. Kyle had destroyed their 20-year marriage, walked away with nearly $200,000, and left Monica emotionally shattered and financially ruined. She'd been living in a studio apartment and working as a waitress when Roy had contacted her. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to call me about Kyle, Monica had told Blake during their video conference. I tried to warn people, but no one would listen. Rich women don't want to believe they could be fooled by someone like him. Monica had agreed to testify in Blake's custody hearing, as had 2 of Kyle's other victims. But more importantly, she'd provided Blake with something invaluable, Kyle's playbook. He's got a whole system, Monica had explained. First, he identifies women whose husbands travel a lot for work. Then he positions himself as the understanding friend, the guy who really sees them. He makes them feel beautiful and appreciated while slowly turning them against their husbands. What's his endgame? Blake had asked. He convinces them to file for divorce, usually claiming emotional abuse or neglect. Then he helps them inflate their claims to maximize the settlement. Once the money comes through, he takes his cut and moves on to the next mark. And the children? Monica's expression had darkened. He uses them as leverage, makes them dependent on him, turns them against their father, then threatens to take them away if the woman doesn't cooperate. My daughter didn't speak to me for 2 years because Kyle convinced her I was betraying her by not divorcing her father sooner. Blake had recorded every word of that conversation. By the time he was finished documenting Kyle's pattern of behavior, he had enough evidence to file criminal charges for fraud, extortion, and child endangerment in multiple states. But Blake wasn't interested in sending Kyle to prison. Prison was too easy, too quick. Blake wanted Kyle to suffer the way Blake had suffered, slowly, completely, and with full understanding of how powerless he really was. The 4th phase of Blake's plan involved Emma and Caleb directly, and it was the most painful thing he'd ever had to do. Through the security footage, Blake had watched his children struggling to understand why their world was falling apart. Emma, always the more perceptive of the 2, had started asking uncomfortable questions about why Kyle couldn't afford to replace the car that had been repossessed. Caleb, younger and more trusting, was simply confused about why his father wouldn't answer his phone calls. Blake had wanted to rush over and explain everything, to show them the evidence of Kyle's manipulation and Tiffany's betrayal. But his lawyer had advised patience. The custody hearing is in 2 weeks, she'd reminded him. If you contact them directly, Tiffany's attorney will claim you're trying to manipulate them. Let the evidence speak for itself. So Blake had waited, watching through hidden cameras as his children's fairy tale world crumbled around them. Kyle's mask was slipping daily as the financial pressure mounted. Without Blake's money to fund their lifestyle, Kyle had been forced to ask Tiffany to get a job, something she hadn't done in over a decade. When she'd struggled to find employment that matched her expectations, Kyle had grown increasingly irritable and demanding. The breaking point had come when Kyle had screamed at Emma for asking too many questions about their situation. Blake had watched his 14-year-old daughter recoil in fear from the man she'd been calling Dad, and he'd had to grip his desk to keep from driving over there immediately. But he'd held himself back because he knew something Kyle didn't. The final phase of his plan was about to begin. Blake had spent 15 years building a business empire, and he'd learned that the most devastating attacks weren't the obvious ones. They were the ones your enemy never saw coming until it was too late to defend against them. Kyle Brennan was about to learn what it meant to be systematically destroyed by someone who understood both patience and power. And unlike Kyle's previous victims, Blake Morrison wasn't some heartbroken spouse looking for justice. He was a predator who'd found another predator in his territory, and he was about to show Kyle exactly how the food chain really worked. Chapter 5. The Reckoning begins. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-October, but Blake's real offensive began 3 days earlier when Leo Cardenas made a very specific phone call to a very specific person. Detective Rodriguez? This is Leo Cardenas. I've got some information about Kyle Brennan that I think you'll find interesting. Detective Carmen Rodriguez had been investigating Kyle for 8 months, ever since a woman named Janet Fleming had filed a complaint alleging that Kyle had defrauded her of $60,000 in a fake investment scheme. The case had gone nowhere because Janet couldn't produce enough evidence, but Rodriguez had suspected Kyle was running more than just romance scams. Leo's call had provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. We've got recorded conversations of Brennan planning insurance fraud, Leo had told Rodriguez. He's been coaching Mrs. Morrison to fake injuries for a personal injury lawsuit. We've also got evidence of him using identity theft to open credit cards in Mr. Morrison's name. The recordings Leo provided were devastating. In one, Kyle could be heard telling Tiffany exactly how to stage a fall down the stairs in Blake's house, complete with instructions on which bruises to photograph and how to time the accident for maximum legal impact. In another, Kyle was coaching her on how to forge Blake's signature on loan applications. What Kyle didn't know was that every conversation had been captured by the surveillance system Blake had installed months earlier. Detective Rodriguez had obtained a warrant within hours, and on Tuesday morning, Kyle Brennan was arrested in Blake's former driveway while loading stolen electronics from the house into his truck. Blake had watched the arrest through his security cameras, savoring every moment as Kyle was handcuffed and read his rights. The charges were serious: fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and theft of property over $10,000. In their state, those charges carried a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years. But the arrest was just the opening move. While Kyle sat in county jail awaiting a bail hearing he couldn't afford, Blake had activated the second part of his plan. Through his lawyer, he'd filed for an emergency restraining order against Kyle, citing the recorded threats and the evidence of criminal activity. The order prohibited Kyle from contacting Emma and Caleb, entering Blake's property, or coming within 500 feet of any member of Blake's family. Tiffany had found herself suddenly alone in a house she couldn't afford, with 2 confused children and no way to pay for basic necessities. The electricity had been shut off that morning for non-payment, and the refrigerator was empty because the grocery delivery service required a credit card she no longer possessed. That's when Blake had made his move. He'd shown up at the house Wednesday evening, not as a husband begging for reconciliation, but as a father collecting his children. Emma and Caleb had been sitting in the dark living room with flashlights, doing homework by candlelight like something out of a Dickens novel. "Dad," Emma had looked up when he'd walked through the front door, her voice uncertain. "Hey, sweetheart," Blake had said gently. "I'm here to take you and Caleb somewhere with electricity and food. Would you like that?" For the first time in months, his children had looked genuinely happy to see him. Tiffany had tried to intervene, of course. She'd rushed down the stairs in one of her designer outfits, hair and makeup perfect despite the fact that she was living like a refugee in her own home. "You can't just take them," she'd protested. "They live here. This is their home." "Actually, this is my home," Blake had replied calmly. "And according to the custody order I obtained this afternoon, The children will be staying with me pending the resolution of criminal charges against your boyfriend. Blake had handed her the court documents, watching her face crumble as she'd read the legal language that stripped her of everything she'd taken for granted. The emergency custody order granted Blake full physical custody of Emma and Caleb until a proper hearing could be held. The restraining order prohibited Kyle from any contact with the children, and the property injunction gave Blake the right to reclaim his house immediately. "This isn't legal," Tiffany had whispered, but Blake could see in her eyes that she knew it was. "You have 24 hours to remove your personal belongings," Blake had continued. "Everything else stays here, since it belongs to me. I suggest you find somewhere else to live, because the locks will be changed tomorrow morning." Emma and Caleb had packed their essential belongings while Tiffany had made frantic phone calls to lawyers who wouldn't take her case. Without a substantial retainer, she couldn't pay. Blake had waited patiently, watching his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, realize that her fairy tale life with Kyle had been built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. But Blake's masterstroke had come as they were leaving. He'd handed Tiffany a single key, not to the house, but to a storage unit across town. "What's this?" she'd asked. "Your new life," Blake had replied. "It's paid up for 1 month. After that, you're on your own." The storage unit contained exactly what Tiffany deserved: a fold-out cot, a mini refrigerator, and 3 boxes of her cheapest clothes. Everything else, the designer gowns, the jewelry, the luxury handbags, had been gifts from Blake, purchased with Blake's money, and they belonged to Blake. As Blake had driven away with his children, he'd seen Tiffany standing in the doorway of the house that was no longer hers, holding a key to a 10-by-10 storage unit, and finally understanding the price of her betrayal. That night, in his penthouse apartment, Blake had sat down with Emma and Caleb for the first real conversation they'd had in months. He'd shown them the evidence of Kyle's manipulation, explained how they'd been used as pawns in a con game, and answered their questions about why their family had fallen apart. Emma, old enough to understand the implications, had cried for an hour. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. "I knew something was wrong," she'd admitted. "Kyle was nice at first, but lately he'd been getting angry all the time. And Mom seemed scared of him." Caleb, younger but equally perceptive, had simply asked, "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" "We're going to be better than okay," Blake had promised. "We're going to be a real family again." But Blake wasn't finished with Tiffany and Kyle. The arrest, the custody order, and the eviction were just the beginning of their punishment. Blake had learned patience from years of building his business, and he understood that true revenge wasn't about quick satisfaction. It was about systematic destruction that lasted long enough for his enemies to understand exactly why they were suffering. Phase 1 had taken away their money and their freedom. Phase 2 had taken away their home and their access to his children. Phase 3 was going to take away their hope. And Blake Morrison was just getting started. Chapter 6: The Web Titans. Kyle's bail hearing had been set for the following Monday, which gave Blake exactly 4 days to ensure that Kyle's legal troubles were just the beginning of his problems. Blake had learned long ago that the most effective way to destroy an enemy wasn't to attack them directly. It was to systematically dismantle every support system they had until they had nowhere left to turn. Kyle Brennan was about to discover that he'd made an enemy with both the resources and the ruthlessness to pursue him across every aspect of his life. Blake's first target was Kyle's other clients. Through Roy's investigation, Blake had identified 3 other wealthy women Kyle was currently cultivating for his romance scam. 2 were in the early stages of emotional manipulation, while the third, a widow named Helen Martinez who owned a successful catering business, was already talking about leaving her late husband's assets to Kyle in her will. Blake had Leo arrange a meeting with each woman, presenting them with documented evidence of Kyle's criminal history and his current arrest. The revelation that their charming fitness instructor was actually a career con artist who specialized in targeting vulnerable women had predictable results. Helen Martinez had been particularly incensed to learn that Kyle had been telling her she was special, while simultaneously seducing 2 other women with identical romantic tactics. She'd immediately called her lawyer to remove Kyle from her will and had filed her own police report detailing Kyle's attempts to manipulate her finances. But Blake's most devastating move had involved Kyle's ex-wife in Nevada. Kyle owed $37,000 in back child support for his 8-year-old daughter, Madison. His ex-wife, Angela Brennan, had been struggling to collect the money for years while working 2 jobs to support their child. Through Blake's lawyer, Angela had learned about Kyle's arrest and his documented pattern of defrauding wealthy women. More importantly, she learned that Kyle had been living an expensive lifestyle while claiming poverty to avoid his child support obligations. Angela had immediately contacted the Nevada District Attorney's Office to pursue criminal charges for willful non-payment of child support. In Nevada, owing more than $10,000 in back support was a felony that carried a potential sentence of up to 6 years in prison. Blake had also arranged for Angela to receive copies of all the financial records documenting Kyle's expensive lifestyle with Tiffany. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, expensive dinners, all while Kyle had been claiming he couldn't afford to support his own daughter. By Friday afternoon, Kyle was facing felony charges in 2 states and had warrants out for his arrest in Nevada. His bail had been denied based on his flight risk and his history of using false identities to avoid legal obligations. But Blake wasn't finished with Kyle. He was just getting started on Tiffany. Tiffany had spent her first night of freedom in the storage unit Blake had provided, sleeping on a cot that cost less than one of her typical lunch bills. She'd tried calling her mother, but Blake had anticipated that move months ago. Tiffany's mother, Martha Walsh, was a widow living on a fixed income who'd always resented Blake for stealing her daughter away from the family. What Martha didn't know was that Blake had been quietly paying for her assisted living facility for the past 3 years. He'd also been covering her medical expenses, her car payment, and the monthly allowance she used to maintain her standard of living. When Tiffany had called begging for help, Martha had been forced to admit that she couldn't afford to support her daughter financially. Worse, Martha was now terrified that her own comfortable situation might be in jeopardy if she angered Blake. "Honey, I just don't understand how you could throw away everything Blake gave you for some fitness instructor," Martha had said during a phone call Blake's surveillance team had recorded. "Blake's been good to this family, and you've been nothing but selfish and ungrateful." Tiffany's friends from the country club had been equally unsympathetic. Most of them were married to Blake's business associates or clients, and they understood which side of the conflict would protect their own interests. Word had spread quickly through their social circle that Tiffany had cheated on Blake with a con artist who was now facing felony charges. In their world, being associated with someone like Tiffany was social suicide. Blake's nuclear option had come in the form of a lawsuit that would have been impossible for most people to pursue, but was merely expensive for someone with his resources. Through his lawyer, Blake had filed a civil suit against both Tiffany and Kyle for fraud, conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and alienation of affection. The lawsuit sought damages of $5 million, a number Blake's attorney had calculated based on the cost of rebuilding Blake's relationship with his children, the impact on his business reputation, and the emotional trauma of discovering his wife's systematic betrayal. More importantly, the lawsuit would require Tiffany to hire her own attorney, pay court costs, and sit for depositions where she'd be forced to answer questions about every aspect of her affair under oath. Since she had no money for legal representation and no family or friends willing to help her, Tiffany would be facing Blake's team of expensive lawyers while representing herself. The psychological impact had been immediate and devastating. Blake had watched through his remaining surveillance equipment as Tiffany had broken down completely, sobbing in the empty house that had once been her sanctuary. She tried calling Kyle's phone, not knowing he was sitting in a jail cell with no prospect of bail. She'd tried calling the lawyers she'd consulted about divorcing Blake, only to discover that none of them would take her case without payment she couldn't provide. By Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after she'd sent Blake that triumphant text message, Tiffany had been reduced to standing outside Blake's office building, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Please help," while wearing the same clothes she'd had on for 3 days. Blake had watched her from his penthouse windows, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction as his cheating wife begged for spare change from strangers who recognized her as the woman who'd been all over the local news for her affair with an accused con artist. That afternoon, Tiffany had finally called Blake's phone, her voice broken and desperate. "Blake, please," she'd whispered. "I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. But I'm sleeping in a storage unit and I haven't eaten in 2 days. Can we please just talk?" "Talk about what?" Blake had replied coldly. "About fixing this. About our family. About giving me another chance." Blake had paused for a long moment, letting her hope build before he delivered the killing blow. Tiffany, you texted me 1 week ago to tell me you'd moved your boyfriend in and that my children were calling him dad. You told me not to bother coming home. So I didn't. And now I never will. But Kyle was arrested. He lied to me. I didn't know he was a criminal. You didn't know he was a criminal, but you knew he was manipulating our children. You knew he was using my money to fund your affair. You knew you were destroying our family, and you did it anyway because you thought you could trade up. Please, Blake. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll go to counseling. You'll what? You'll pretend to be sorry until you find another Kyle? You'll fake being a good mother until the next time someone offers you something you think is better? Blake had watched her through his security feeds as she'd collapsed onto the sidewalk, finally understanding that her actions had consequences she'd never considered. The children and I are going to be fine, Blake had continued. We're going to be a family again, a real family, without people who think love is something you can trade away when a better offer comes along. What about me? Tiffany had sobbed. What am I supposed to do? Blake had smiled as he delivered his final words to the woman who'd betrayed him. I honestly don't care. You made your choice, Tiffany. Now live with it. As Blake had hung up the phone, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The woman who'd systematically destroyed his family was getting exactly what she deserved, and his children were finally safe from her poisonous influence. But Blake's revenge wasn't complete yet. He still had one more phase to execute, and it would ensure that neither Tiffany nor Kyle would ever be able to hurt another family the way they'd hurt his. Some lessons Blake had learned needed to be permanent. Chapter 7. The Final Judgment. The permanent custody hearing was scheduled for the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, but Blake had spent the intervening weeks ensuring that the outcome was never in doubt. Judge Patricia Henley had a reputation for thorough preparation, and Blake had made certain she had everything she needed to make the right decision for Emma and Caleb. The evidence Blake presented was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. Security footage showed Kyle manipulating the children against their father. Audio recordings captured Kyle coaching Tiffany to commit insurance fraud. Financial records proved that Kyle had been living off stolen money while abandoning his own daughter in Nevada. But the most damaging testimony had come from Emma herself. At 14, Emma was old enough to testify about her preferences in custody arrangements, and her words had cut through the courtroom like a blade. She described how Kyle had gradually isolated her from her father, promising her a better life, while systematically destroying the family she'd known. She'd talked about feeling scared and confused as Kyle's mask had slipped, revealing an angry and controlling man who bore no resemblance to the charming figure he'd presented initially. I don't want to live with my mom anymore, Emma had said clearly, looking directly at Judge Henley. She chose Kyle over me and Caleb. She chose him over our family. I want to stay with my dad, where I feel safe. Caleb, too young to testify formally, had been interviewed by a court-appointed child psychologist who'd concluded that both children showed signs of emotional manipulation and were strongly bonded to their father. Tiffany's court-appointed attorney, a public defender who'd been assigned to her case after she'd proven she couldn't afford private representation, had tried to argue that she'd been a victim of Kyle's manipulation as much as anyone else. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Text messages between Tiffany and Kyle showed her actively participating in plans to defraud Blake and manipulate the children. Financial records proved she'd been living far beyond any reasonable means while her husband worked 18-hour days to support her lifestyle. Most damaging of all, recorded conversations revealed her discussing how to maximize her divorce settlement while showing no concern for the impact on Emma and Caleb. Kyle, still in jail awaiting trial on multiple felony charges, hadn't even been permitted to attend the hearing. His parental rights regarding Madison had been terminated in Nevada after Angela's lawsuit had revealed the full extent of his financial crimes. He was facing a minimum of 10 years in prison across multiple jurisdictions, and his sentence would likely run much longer. Judge Henley's ruling had been swift and decisive. Full permanent custody to Blake, with Tiffany granted supervised visitation once per month, contingent on her completing parenting classes and psychological counseling. But Blake's most devastating victory had come in the form of the judge's written opinion, which had been filed as public record and picked up by local media outlets hungry for a sensational story about wealthy families destroying themselves. This court finds that Mrs. Morrison's conduct represents a fundamental abandonment of her parental responsibilities, Judge Henley had written. Her willingness to allow an unvetted adult male to assume a parental role with her minor children, combined with her participation in criminal schemes designed to defraud her husband, demonstrates a pattern of behavior that places her own desires above the welfare of her children. The judge had been even harsher in her assessment of Kyle. Mr. Brennan represents the worst kind of predator, one who targets families for systematic destruction while manipulating vulnerable children for his own benefit. This court strongly recommends that his criminal prosecution proceed to the fullest extent of the law. But Blake's final masterstroke had come in the form of a civil settlement that would ensure Tiffany could never again pose a threat to another family. Through his lawyers, Blake had offered Tiffany a deal. She could accept a settlement of $50,000 and agree to leave the state permanently, or she could continue fighting the $5 million lawsuit while representing herself against Blake's team of attorneys. The $50,000 came with conditions that would follow Tiffany for the rest of her life. She would be prohibited from dating or cohabiting with any man who had children under 18. She would be required to disclose her criminal history to any potential romantic partners. She would submit to random psychological evaluations for 5 years to ensure she was addressing her behavioral issues. Most importantly, she would agree to a DNA registry that would alert law enforcement if she ever had children with another man, ensuring that any future offspring would be protected from her documented pattern of child endangerment. Tiffany had signed the agreement without reading it carefully, desperate to escape the legal nightmare Blake had created around her. She'd taken the $50,000 and moved to Florida, where she'd rented a studio apartment and found work as a sales clerk in a discount clothing store. But Blake's revenge didn't end with Tiffany's exile. He'd also arranged for Kyle's story to be shared with law enforcement agencies across the country, ensuring that Kyle's methods would be recognized and prevented in the future. Angela Brennan had become a vocal advocate for stronger enforcement of child support laws, using Kyle's case as an example of how career criminals could exploit the system while their victims suffered. The 3 other women Kyle had been planning to victimize had formed a support group for romance scam survivors, turning their near miss with disaster into a resource for other vulnerable women. As for Blake himself, he'd emerged from the battle stronger and more focused than ever. His business had actually grown during the legal proceedings, as clients and competitors alike had recognized his skill at protecting what mattered to him. Emma and Caleb had thrived in their new environment, free from the toxic influences that had been poisoning their development. But perhaps most importantly, Blake had learned to trust his instincts again. He'd ignored the warning signs of Tiffany's betrayal because he'd wanted to believe in the family he'd built. Now he understood that real family wasn't about blood or legal documents. It was about loyalty, respect, and shared values. Emma and Caleb had those qualities. They'd proven their character by standing with their father when it mattered most, and Blake knew they'd grow up to be strong, principled adults who understood the difference between love and manipulation. As Blake had tucked his children into bed on the night after the custody hearing, Emma had asked him a question that proved she'd learned the most important lesson of all. "Dad, how did you know Kyle was lying when he said he loved us?" Blake had thought carefully before answering, wanting to give her wisdom she could carry into adulthood. "Real love doesn't ask you to choose," he'd said finally. "Real love doesn't try to turn you against the people who've always been there for you. And real love doesn't disappear when the money runs out." Emma had nodded solemnly, and Blake had known that his daughter would never be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation Kyle had specialized in. The war was over, and Blake Morrison had won completely. But more than that, he'd reclaimed his family and taught his children lessons that would protect them for the rest of their lives. Some victories, Blake reflected, were worth every dollar they cost and every enemy they created. Chapter 8: The Reckoning. 6 months after the custody hearing, Blake received a phone call that brought him immense satisfaction. Detective Rodriguez was calling to inform him that Kyle Brennan had been convicted on all charges in 3 states and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. "The judge threw the book at him," Rodriguez explained. "Between the romance scams, the identity theft, the child support violations, and the conspiracy charges from your case, Brennan's looking at spending the rest of his productive years behind bars." Kyle's conviction had been the culmination of a domino effect that Blake had set in motion. Once Kyle's methods were exposed, victims had emerged from multiple states. The FBI had eventually taken over the case, revealing that Kyle was part of a larger network of romance scammers who'd been operating across the country for over a decade. Blake had been asked to testify at Kyle's sentencing hearing, and he'd used the opportunity to speak directly to the man who'd tried to destroy his family. "You came into my home and turned my children against me," Blake had said, standing at the witness podium while Kyle sat shackled at the defendant's table. "You manipulated my wife into betraying everything we'd built together. You thought you could steal my life and walk away with the profits." Kyle had refused to make eye contact, but Blake had continued anyway. "What you didn't understand is that everything you wanted, my money, my house, my family, I built from nothing through hard work and sacrifice. You thought you could take it with lies and manipulation, but you never understood what it actually cost to create." Blake had paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final statement. "You're going to spend the next 22 years learning what it means to have nothing. And every day you're in prison, I want you to remember that you're there because you tried to steal from someone who was stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than you ever imagined." The judge had nodded approvingly as Blake had returned to his seat, and Kyle's fate had been sealed. But Kyle's imprisonment wasn't the only satisfaction Blake had received. Tiffany's exile to Florida had proven even more devastating than Blake had anticipated. The conditions of her settlement had made it nearly impossible for her to rebuild her life. Every time she tried to date someone, the requirement to disclose her history had ended the relationship before it could begin. Her work history showed a 15-year gap where she'd been a housewife, leaving her qualified only for minimum wage jobs that couldn't support the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. Most crushing of all, the monthly supervised visits with Emma and Caleb had gradually dwindled as the children had grown older and more independent. Emma, now 15, had been old enough to refuse the visits entirely, while Caleb had continued seeing his mother only out of a sense of obligation rather than genuine affection. Blake had monitored Tiffany's situation through the private investigator, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He needed to ensure she wasn't planning any kind of comeback or revenge of her own. What he discovered was a broken woman living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment, working retail jobs, and spending her evenings alone watching television shows about the wealthy lifestyle she'd thrown away. Tiffany had aged rapidly under the stress of her new circumstances. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by discount store outfits. The expensive beauty treatments were a memory, and the woman who'd once commanded attention at country club events now looked like any other middle-aged retail worker struggling to make ends meet. Blake felt no sympathy for her situation. She'd made her choices with full knowledge of the consequences, and she was simply living with the results of her decisions. But the most profound changes had been in Blake's own family. Emma had blossomed into a confident young woman who understood the value of loyalty and hard work. She'd maintained excellent grades, joined the debate team, and had already begun talking about following in her father's footsteps in business. Caleb had grown into a thoughtful 12-year-old who showed none of the entitlement that had marked his earlier years. He'd learned to appreciate what he had and to understand that his father's success came from dedication and sacrifice rather than luck or inheritance. Blake had also learned to balance his work and family life in ways he'd never managed during his marriage. Without Tiffany's constant demands for more money and status symbols, Blake found he could provide for his children's needs while still being present for school events, sports games, and family dinners. The penthouse apartment had become a real home, filled with laughter and conversation instead of the tense silences that had characterized his marriage's final years. Emma and Caleb had friends over regularly, and Blake had discovered he enjoyed being the father who could provide guidance and support without constantly worrying about his wife's judgment or demands. Blake had also begun dating again, though he approached relationships with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd learned the difference between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. He'd met Sarah Chun, a successful attorney who'd built her own practice from scratch and understood the value of independence and mutual respect. Sarah had her own money, her own goals, and her own life. She wasn't looking for someone to support her financially or provide her with status symbols. Instead, she appreciated Blake's intelligence, his dedication to his children, and his ability to build something meaningful from nothing. Emma and Caleb had warmed to Sarah gradually, recognizing that she represented everything their mother hadn't been: authentic, supportive, and genuinely interested in their welfare rather than her own comfort. 6 months into their relationship, Blake had realized he was experiencing something he'd never had with Tiffany: a partnership between equals based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. But perhaps most importantly, Blake had learned to trust his instincts again. The warning signs that had been there throughout his marriage were now impossible to ignore. He understood the difference between someone who loved him and someone who loved what he could provide for them. As Blake sat in his office on a Tuesday evening, reviewing reports from his dealerships while Emma did homework at the conference table and Caleb practiced piano in the next room, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man who'd once worked 18-hour days to avoid going home to a wife who resented his absence now looked forward to family dinners and weekend activities. The father who'd felt like a stranger in his own house now had children who sought his advice and enjoyed his company. Blake had learned that true success wasn't about accumulating wealth or status symbols. It was about building something that couldn't be stolen or manipulated away from you. His relationship with Emma and Caleb was stronger than it had ever been, precisely because it had been tested and proven. They'd been through the worst that life could throw at a family, and they'd emerged closer and more resilient than before. Blake Morrison had lost a wife and gained his soul. He'd lost a house and gained a home. He'd lost his illusions about love and marriage, but he'd found something more valuable: the knowledge that he could protect what mattered most to him, no matter who tried to take it away. As he watched his children working quietly nearby, Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete satisfaction with his life exactly as it was. The war was over, and the right side had won. Chapter 9: Legacy. 2 years after Kyle's conviction, Blake received an unexpected visitor at his office. Emma, now 17 and preparing for her senior year of high school, had asked to speak with him privately about something important. "Dad," she'd said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the poise of someone far older than her years, "I've been thinking about Kyle and Mom, and I want you to know something." Blake had set aside his work, giving her his full attention. Over the past 2 years, Emma had grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, confident, and possessed of a moral clarity that Blake both admired and envied. She'd inherited his analytical mind, but combined it with an emotional intelligence that he was still learning to develop. "What you did to them," Emma had continued, "destroying their lives the way they tried to destroy ours. I understand why you had to do it. They were predators, and predators don't stop until someone stops them." Blake had nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading. "But I also want you to know that watching you rebuild our family taught me something more important than revenge," Emma had said. "It taught me what real strength looks like. Real strength isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about protecting the people you love and building something they can't take away from you." Emma had paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not saying you were wrong to destroy Kyle and Mom. They deserved everything they got, and probably worse. But the most important thing you did wasn't punishing them. It was showing Caleb and me what a real father looks like. What real love looks like." Blake had felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You could have spent the rest of your life being angry and bitter about what they did to us," Emma had continued. "Instead, you chose to focus on building something better. You chose us. Every day, you choose us. That's what I'm going to remember when I have my own family someday." That conversation had stayed with Blake long after Emma had returned to her college preparation. She was right, of course. The revenge he'd taken on Tiffany and Kyle had been necessary, but ultimately secondary to the more important work of rebuilding his relationship with his children. Blake had learned that true victory wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about becoming someone they could never defeat, no matter what they did to you. The evidence of that victory was everywhere in his life now. His business had expanded to include dealerships in 2 additional states, but Blake had learned to delegate more effectively, allowing him to maintain the work-life balance that had been impossible during his marriage. Emma was headed to Stanford on a partial academic scholarship, while Caleb had developed into a gifted musician who performed with the city's youth orchestra. Blake's relationship with Sarah had evolved into a partnership that strengthened both of their lives without consuming either of them. They'd moved in together the previous year, creating a blended household that felt natural and supportive rather than forced or desperate. Most importantly, Blake had discovered that the family he'd built with Emma and Caleb was stronger and more resilient than anything he'd lost. They'd been tested by the worst kind of betrayal and had emerged with their bonds intact and their values clarified. But Blake's most profound realization had come 6 months earlier, when Caleb had asked him a question that had forced Blake to confront the true scope of what he'd accomplished. "Dad," Caleb had said during one of their weekend hiking trips, "do you ever feel sorry for Mom?" Blake had considered the question carefully before answering. Did he feel sorry for Tiffany? She was 40 years old, working minimum-wage jobs, and living alone in a studio apartment in a city where she knew no one. Her children barely tolerated her monthly visits, and she had no realistic prospect of improving her situation. "I feel sorry for the person she could have been," Blake had said finally. "I feel sorry that she chose to destroy something good instead of appreciating what she had. But I don't feel sorry for the consequences of her choices." "Do you think she's learned anything?" Caleb had asked. Blake had shrugged. "I hope so for her sake. But whether she learns or not doesn't matter to us anymore. We learned what we needed to learn, and we built something better." That exchange had crystallized something Blake had been thinking about for months. His revenge against Tiffany and Kyle hadn't been an end in itself. It had been a necessary step in protecting his family and creating space for them to heal and grow. The destruction of his enemies had been thorough and permanent, but it had served a larger purpose than mere satisfaction. It had sent a clear message to anyone who might consider targeting his family in the future. Blake Morrison was not a man to be trifled with, and the people under his protection were off-limits. More importantly, it had taught Emma and Caleb that actions have consequences, that loyalty matters, and that some betrayals are simply unforgivable. Those were lessons that would serve them well in their own lives, protecting them from the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed their family. As Blake sat in his office on a Friday evening, preparing to leave early for Emma's graduation ceremony, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 years ago, he'd been a successful businessman trapped in a marriage to a woman who'd seen him only as a source of funding for her lifestyle. He'd been estranged from children who'd viewed him as a distant figure who provided for their material needs, but played no real role in their emotional lives. Now he was the father of 2 remarkable young adults who sought his advice, enjoyed his company, and shared his values. He was in a relationship with a woman who challenged him intellectually and supported him emotionally without needing him to fund her existence. He was running a business that provided for his family's needs while still allowing him to be present for the moments that mattered. Blake had learned that the best revenge wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about building a life so strong and fulfilling that their attacks became irrelevant. Tiffany and Kyle had tried to steal his family, his money, and his future. In the end, they'd lost everything while Blake had gained something more valuable than anything they'd tried to take: the knowledge that he was exactly the man he'd always wanted to be. As Blake locked his office and headed to Emma's graduation, he carried with him the satisfaction of a man who'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and more grateful for what truly mattered. The war was over, and Blake Morrison had won the only victory that counted. He'd protected his family and built a legacy worth leaving behind. In the end, that was revenge enough. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.